Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's State of the Nation panel session on sustainable infrastructure and just what we've seen in terms of thinking and trends over the last 18 months. My name's Jared Ball. I'm the Chief Economist at CEDA, and it's a pleasure to be facilitating today's discussion. Well, there is a certain inevitability, really, about infrastructure-related stimulus during economic downturns. And so we have seen, as a result of this COVID-related economic recession, governments across the world lean on infrastructure-related stimulus, a proven form of stimulus and something that boosts productive capacity for the long term in the economy. But this time's also different because we've seen a number of shifts in the way that people are living their lives and the way that they're using infrastructure during this period. Some shifts permanent and some perhaps temporary. And so what we want to do is explore how those shifts have impacted the infrastructure landscape and what we're likely to see in the longer term, particularly as it relates to sustainability and resilience of infrastructure. And we've got a really excellent panel today, I have to say, to explore that issue. We've got Muir Lam-Frendo from the CEO of the Global Infrastructure Hub, Romilly Madew, AO, who is the CEO of Infrastructure Australia. And of course, we've got Natalie Muir, who's the General Manager of Water and Environment at Cardno as well. So as I always say when I do these sessions, please jump into our Q&A portal early and often and start to get your questions into the system so that we can start to ask those when we start the Q&A. You'll see that on the screen, but you can also go to ceda.pigeonhole.at and use the code SON2021 to get in there and ask your questions of our expert panel. I'm going to talk to the panel for about 20 minutes, but then we've got plenty of time for Q&A. So please get those questions in for us. I want to start with you, Marie. Obviously, the Global Infrastructure Hub, you had your megatrends report last year, which I think may have even been before COVID or just as COVID struck. And you've obviously been doing a lot of work through the G20 COVID-19 action plan around how we can monitor the developments in infrastructure, including through data tracking of just all the different projects that we're seeing across the world at the moment. What do you see as some of the key ingredients globally in terms of successful, sustainable, resilient infrastructure? Who are some of the global leaders, I guess, and where do you see Australia sitting in that picture at the moment?
Yeah, thank you very much for your question. And you're right, this report, we released it just at the time. We actually work on this before COVID, and we released it just at the time that COVID really unfolded. And it really looked at the mega trend from the infrastructure industry globally. So we interviewed more 400 experts in infrastructure, really across the entire value chain. And there is now a clear recognition that well-established trends are disrupting infrastructure in a way that is more rapid and profound than experienced in the past. And in this future report, we identified the mega trends that industry leaders were most concerned about. And using these insights, we created 3 different scenarios. And at the time of a report, actually, that seems extreme but plausible. So the first one was a scenario of a conflicted planet. I mean, we know we are evolving now in an increasingly multipolar world. And infrastructure, when you think of this at a global level, will not really realize its entire benefit if they cannot maximize spillovers, right? So it's kind of very important then to ensure that more work is done to ensure that this multipolar world could be more conducive of infrastructure. The second one was the digital planet, because obviously we are working today in planning and designing the infrastructure for 2050. But is it future-proof? I mean, the reality is that we've done a lot of work with the G20 on infratech, and we realized that somehow most of the countries are a bit behind in adopting the technology that will ensure that in 2050 and beyond, the infrastructure will serve the needs of the community. And the last one was the green planet. And as we know, with all of the climate change, and consideration that is happening, and more recently with the G7 and even the G20, where all of the question of climate change have really come in big force with a new sustainable finance working group being created, co-chaired by China and the US. So of course, as we move further in 2021, this seems less extreme in the context of a global pandemic we are still confronting. And really over the past 18 months, as I mentioned, we've seen a lot of those changes happening with governments, really considering the fact that also ESG and sustainability in investment is not really now a must-have as opposed to a nice-to-have. And this perception has changed tremendously over the last 3 years. We conducted a survey 3 years ago, and at the time we realized that 36% of the investors were considering ESG as a first order question. And as we would be probably redoing this survey in the future, I'm sure we'll see those particular data increasing tremendously. And if you compare again from 5 years ago, the same survey showed only 17%. So 17% 5 years ago, then 36% 3 years ago. And then I'm sure now this is a very steep ramping curve. So private investors, multilateral development banks have really led the way in taking tangible action with many commitments, a large part of our financing to green investment. So I want to mention that the example really is including the release of the Climate Change Action Plan of the World Bank that was actually presented in the G20 Deputy Finance Minister meeting earlier this week, but also the European Bank of Reconstruction and Development, which aims at increasing green financing to more than 50% by 2025. So we see some very aggressive targets that are really taken by the MDBs. As I mentioned earlier, also, this is really growing up within investors. We are about to release some data that shows that the top 20 largest private investors in primary market have been increasingly adopting, and it's a very steep curve of increasing in the last 5 years. So you could see that the trend, if you look back at what has been happening in the last 15 years, has nothing comparable. But this could be also compared with the trend that you see of adoption of sustainability-linked bonds, of sustainability-linked loans, even steeper than when the green bond started. So there is really a momentum that is happening. Private investors also are increasing their ESG maturity with moving beyond ESG classification to more rigorous impact investment standards, realizing that the do no harm of ESG is probably not sufficient to get to the climate target. So I think ultimately this means that increasingly access to finance or refinancing in key markets is going to be contingent on government demonstrating tangible consideration of resilience and sustainability in their investment. And the task is vital because our Outlook report estimates that the infrastructure funding gap will reach 15 trillion in 2040 and is continuing to increase. So also what I wanted to mention is a piece of work that the Global Infrastructure Hub is currently working on, which is a data tool that tracks global stimulus announcement. So very preliminary findings indicate that G20 countries have announced almost $2 trillion of infrastructure in response to COVID-19. And this data tool will be launched on our website in the coming month. And we're completing currently further analysis on the potential impacts of this infrastructure investment on sustainability and resilience. But just wanted to mention here that this piece of work is the overarching priority for infrastructure for the G20 this year. So that gives you, I think, a clear signal about the importance that governments are putting into infrastructure as part of the recovery. And one also data that we unfold in the ramp up of those considerations by the G20 to finance minister was really the fiscal multiplier effect of infrastructure, which from the research that we conducted on more than 3,000 multipliers really demonstrated that the fiscal multiplier was of 1.5 from 2 to 5 years for public investment as opposed to 1.0 for public spending. So I think this is really a macroeconomic data that really show the importance and the impact that infrastructure can have. And so, as I mentioned, sustainability and resilience seems to be quite at the core of what has been put into the stimuli from the various countries, but definitely more work needs to be done to continue monitoring this implementation moving forward. So very briefly, the ingredients needed to respond to these challenges. And I think Australia has been leading the way on many fronts. And particularly, I think, having worked also myself in lots of emerging markets and around the world in the last 20 years, I could say that really leveraging capacity for stakeholder engagement in infrastructure investment, I think that's really a core success, key success of Australia could really make a lot of others benefit from. And why this is important, because it will increase making infrastructure more sustainable and resilient through more inclusive decision-making. The second thing that I wanted to mention was governance is also key. We know that the earlier sustainability and resilience is built into the infrastructure decision-making lifecycle, the more likely that those outcomes will be achieved. So this can be helped by streamlining our investment decision-making policy to better account for sustainability and resilience. And the third and last point that I wanted to make is we also need to make this type of decision-making policies more accessible. And in this space, we're currently working on a shorthand cost-benefit analysis tool to better account for broader economic, social, and environmental impacts for rapid bus transit projects. So more of this type of work is needed, but I think at least we could see also a lot of governments at the G20 that increasingly are keen to embed that type of tools to ensure that the sustainability and resilience could be made really at the core of a project from the get-go.
Well, thank you, Marie, and I guess some encouraging words there in terms of how Australia's doing, and a good point at which to bring Romilly into the conversation. Romilly, at IA, you've obviously done some specific work around these kind of trends that we've seen over COVID-19 in terms of infrastructure. Can you tell us a little bit about some of those findings? And I guess, I think we're all grappling with, whether it's across infrastructure or the economy or other sectors at the moment, about which trends are going to be permanent, which might be temporary, and perhaps the way in which they interact with some of these longer term shifts that we've been seeing in terms of digitisation and decarbonisation. What's your research telling you on some of these things?
Thanks, great question. So we did some research which we released in December, but we believe still holds, and it really is the impact of COVID on infrastructure. So some of the trends that came through, no one will be unsurprised, is digitisation, decentralisation, localism, service innovation and adaptability. But what it really showed is that there's some other areas that we really need to think about, because other things happened last year. The decrease in public transport use, is that going to stick, or is that just happening because we're in the middle of COVID? Waste. Our waste increased because people were at home and doing more online shopping. The importance of data really came to the front, and the focus on resilience, considering that just before COVID we were dealing with bushfires, floods, and then we had the pandemic. So understanding resilience and shocks and stresses. So coming back to the first question, are these trends, and there's multiple trends and we all know what they are, some really good ones are like increase in access to green space and increase to active transport. Are they going to stick? What's really important is the UK National Infrastructure Commission did some work on this, and they looked at previous scenarios of other shocks and stresses, and what they found is it really depends on the length of time that we are in this type of challenge that we are dealing with. And it showed that we adapt as we're dealing with the pandemic, which is what we all are in this case, but that people really do go back to business as usual, to what they were used to. And some things may stick, like working from home, but others, like public transport and the reduction of public transport use, will probably just go back to normal. Because the other trend that came up is the increase in congestion is now worse than it was pre-COVID. So really the word I would say is unique uncertainty. We can't say we don't know. And an example of the fact of what's happening in Sydney right now shows that. I just want to raise a couple of other really important points to put into context. We have the highest, and you mentioned this, the highest investment spend, stimulus spend in infrastructure than we've ever had. It's up 26% from 2019-2020. That's the first point. The second point, you also mentioned the importance of streamlining. But that also brings into account procurement So when you talk about streamlining, you're fast-tracking procurement. We're currently talking about sustainability and resilience, and most of that procurement is delivered by states and territories, all who have signed up to net zero by 2050. But the issue is this: have they embedded in their procurement policies undertaking of consideration of sustainability and resilience in planning, and including that in their procurement policies, and more work needs to be done. IA undertook some research last year and found a fragmented approach across all states and territories when it came to incorporating sustainability in procurement decision-making. So one of the challenges we really have is there is, and Marie has stated this, there is definitely an increased focus on sustainability and resilience, but we're not necessarily seeing that being embedded in the decision-making that's coming through this huge stimulus package that we have. So it's really important, considering that infrastructure influences 70% of Australia's emissions, that at a state and territory level, that at the procurement stage and in the planning stage, we are embedding these requirements into our decision making. And the final point is, again, Marie touched on this, I can't stress enough the importance of data. We saw that coming out of COVID, the focus on data, but there is no standard use of data when it comes to infrastructure in Australia. So if you asked me, tell me, what does it look like for public transport use, or what does safety look like on site, we would be literally drawing fragmented data from every state and territory and then trying to compile it and paint a picture for you, because we don't have this standardisation of how we collect data and report on data. And if one thing COVID showed us, the importance of data and using it in our decision making is really important. And again, the UK National Infrastructure Commission released a report, Data for Public Good, and it really keeps saying we need to use data in decision making. So there are some great pockets of example around Australia at all our states and territories. What we've got to do is, it can't just be pockets of example. We can't have a fragmented approach. And we are all working together, and COVID did bring us all together to work together, but we need to do it faster, and we need to agree on a standardisation in our approaches.
Thanks, Romilly. Some really good points there, particularly really like your last two around the need to embed requirements on sustainability, but also the point around data, absolutely critical in terms of taking, as you say, some of those pockets where we are doing the data connection work well, and spreading that across the system and all states and territories in a unified way. I want to come to you, Natalie, because interested in what you're seeing on the ground with the clients and the communities that you work with, both in Australia and globally, in terms of how they're looking at sustainability and kind of the demands that perhaps they are putting around this, and what we sort of need to get it working at a really practical on the ground level.
Yeah, sure, Jared. Look, I guess from our client's perspective, across the globe, it is fairly mixed in terms of the sustainability messaging and how embedded that is in the projects. Interestingly, I think there's quite different language across the globe as well. Sort of in the US, you probably talk a little bit more about ESGs. In our international development space, sustainable development goals are really front of mind. We see in the UK, net zero is really their language. In Australia, I think certainly that resilience piece, with which both Marie and Romilly have talked about, I think is really front of mind, and that's the piece that we're probably seeing playing out a lot. My background's in the water industry. We had a conference in May this year called Ozwater, and I guess some of the themes associated with that was really under that resilient circular economy banner. So sustainability coming to the fore for sure, but I guess really around those key pieces of resilience and circular economy. I guess my background's also in the front end of projects too, in that project planning, and music to my ears, I guess, to hear from both Marie and Romilly about the involvement early on in the process, because I think probably what we're seeing an awful lot of is projects as they're getting into as projects are developing, trying to make them more sustainable and trying to make infrastructure projects more sustainable. But I think we need to start back in the inception phase, in the project development phase, and actually look at sustainable infrastructure solutions, which might actually be, quite different. That's your, non-infrastructure solutions, your no-build solutions. Are there green infrastructure solutions or something a little bit different along those lines that we can think differently and try to get that sustainability piece embedded from the outset? And then continue to look at how we take carbon out, obviously, as we go through the life cycle. But I think really critical that we get in and look at that early. And I don't think we're quite seeing that yet from a client perspective or from the policymakers, I guess. In terms of, what we need to do to get it right on the ground, it's like a good engineering problem. It needs a real collaborative effort and a multidisciplinary team. So, the right people in the room at the right time, all sorts of things, lots of terminology around about adaptive planning, scenario planning, and making sure we're sort of looking at what the future might look like and ensuring that our infrastructure can be adaptive and can change to what the future might hold for us. So, looking at taking carbon out at each of those different stages of the life cycle and trying to, really trying to make the world, to build back better, I guess, is some of the other things we're sort of seeing. So thinking about how do we actually use our infrastructure solutions to benefit sustainability.
Thanks, Natalie, and thank you to everyone for starting to put some questions into the portal. I would encourage you to keep doing that. There's some good ones in there, but always good to have more. I want to come back around briefly to each of the panel. All of you have kind of touched on various areas where we can improve or where we need to focus our energy. And obviously there's a number of things here around capability, around governance, around the policies that we have. And interested to get each of your insights into kind of the kind of priority areas, I guess, in which you'd like to see some improvement. And perhaps starting with you, Marie, in terms of the global picture and what we need to embed globally.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think that's really what is core, because you want to concentrate on the solutions, right? I think as it comes to infrastructure, too often we are polarized onto the issue, and there is some very good solution out there. So, and I'm going to probably also replay some of the comments that Romilly and Natalie had previously, because the first thing is really at the back of at the core of the success is the collaboration. And because we have so many different players within the infrastructure for one single infrastructure project, there needs to have much more co-creation. So collaboration is key, as it is only through coordinated action that this collective challenge can be addressed. And I think we need to connect here the engineering minds to the policy minds, the land user planners, private investors, banks. So this will mean that the capability of infrastructure managers, investors, and decision makers also need to expand to allow them to think across sectors and outside of the box. So I think we really need to work in this co-creation space and being sometimes ready to break down those barriers to just say, let's try to find a solution. I think governance also that allow for this cross-sector collaboration is needed, because very often across the world, you see it's actually quite complicated to be able to have people from one sector to talk to another one. And then, well, you ended up having problems in planning because the guy from the road hasn't been talking to the guys in another ministry, sometimes working with all the railways. So I think this very basic governance is key. And actually on that front, I'm happy to mention that the Global Infrastructure Hub, in partnership with Infrastructure Australia, has established an international forum of infrastructure bodies, as we call it, the I-bodies from across the world, who can meet and exchange ideas and experience and learning. But I wanted to say that infrastructure bodies like Infrastructure Australia and the equivalent that you have in the UK and in Canada is not very widely spread. And so that's really something that governments needs to think about. There is a lot of discussion currently about infrastructure banks. You've heard, the UK is creating one, then India has made some announcement. There is a lot of rumbling in the US also related to that. I think somehow that's also a way to create capacity and capability to really support those infrastructure projects. But even before thinking about a bank, I think really having a body, an infrastructure body that could really provide that continuity, that capability, and that sound check is actually quite necessary. And as I mentioned, interestingly, not particularly widely spread. So, so the second point that I wanted to mention is the capability to innovate. And we need to innovate to overcome those barriers, such as the green bottleneck to sustainability, where we are better able to manage limited resources, for example, as required for, lithium, for example, required for this transition. So there is a lot of those transition that needs to happen, but we need to be really coordinated on that regard. And really how to innovate, how to bring innovation to infrastructure, which is really lagging behind. I mean, last year when we worked with the Saudi presidency, we delivered a very big piece of work on infratech. And then when we did the early evaluation, we realized our infrastructure was lagging behind in terms of technology adoption. So I think here, and I mentioned in my early point, I think that's really key. And on that front, the hub, under the sponsorship of the G20 presidency, which is with Italy this year, we are having an Infra Challenge competition, which in 2021, we had the first edition last year, invited global innovators to submit their technology-based solution for better and more resilient infrastructure. So we're really on the theme. And one of the examples that I wanted to mention of our top 20 teams was using technology to build resiliency in road infrastructure. So it's actually a technology that can model climate change effects and offer design and material solutions for increased resilience and sustainability. It's just one example of also trying to bring this really to life. And we will actually be announcing the top 10 of the Infra Challenge in the coming weeks. But I think this competition, and there are many other efforts, but we need to see more, right? We need to see more, especially for technology to be able to come up to infrastructure more systematically and really breaking the barrier of funding it, right? Because at this stage, there is a lot of reluctance because it's seen as potentially an increase in CapEx. But the reality and the real question that one needs to ask is that what is the benefit for the community? And really having more technology will probably going to be served better the community down the track if I'm thinking of like 30 or 40 years ahead of us.
Thanks, Marie. I love the idea of the Infra Challenge and perhaps a bit of an infrastructure hack session using technology on this stuff. That's really interesting. Romilly, you obviously mentioned the importance of data and embedding those requirements at the state level. Is there anything else that hits the kind of top of the priority list from IA at the moment in terms of how we might embed sustainability and resilience a little bit more?
Sure. So I think in three areas. One is really taking a systems-based approach, and that's not unusual. People have heard of systems-based approaches before, and when you think about the interconnectedness of infrastructure, we need to take that on board. The other one that IA has been talking about for some time is place-based planning, bringing in the community into decision-making and understanding the unique geographies in Australia. So one focus on sustainability that may benefit an urban approach may not necessarily be the right approach when we're thinking about a rural, remote or regional Australia. So thinking about place-based planning and incorporating that into decision-making. And I'm going to go back to it, and it's been mentioned again by all speakers, is the importance around governance and use of data. So what is IA doing about this? Well, a number of things. We released sustainability principles that is driving our own work a number of weeks ago, and you can download that from our website. And that takes both economic, social, environmental, and a governance lens, and that really is responding to the SDG goals and what is coming out globally. The other thing we're doing is working very closely with Infrastructure New South Wales on resilience research, which we'll be releasing shortly. We've also updated our assessment framework. So as everyone knows, we have the infrastructure pipeline, which is a crucially important pipeline of unfunded investments. But how do you get on the pipeline is using our assessment framework. So in the assessment framework, which will be has been refreshed and is about to be released, we've updated three key areas. So strategic fit, societal impact and deliverability. But in strategic fit, we've included quality of life, productivity, environment, sustainability and resilience. And then we've also included guidance on those specific areas. So it's really us saying, well, here's some guidance to incorporate in your decision making when you're doing business cases. Please include this right up front. So I've talked about the importance of highlighting the investments, and we do have a number on the infrastructure priority list, such as coastal inundation. We've called that out as being really important, but also importance of our regional telecommunications and some of the failure we saw through the bushfires around the loss of telecommunications and the importance of making sure there's resilience in our telecommunication systems around Australia. So what are we finally doing about it? I've talked about a number of areas. The final one is the release of our Australian Infrastructure Plan 2021 in the coming weeks. Specifically under sustainability and resilience, we talk about balancing infrastructure outcomes in an uncertain future, and we highlight technology-led sustainability as well as transparency and collaboration, building trust in decisions. So really it's identifying the reforms, understanding the challenges and opportunities, coming back to the word Marie used, collaboration. Let's not reinvent the wheel here. There's some great examples around Australia where this has worked well. I have come from a property and construction background, and it has really been embedded in property and construction. We know how to do this. We have the skills in Australia and the experience in Australia already across Australia, both in property and construction and infrastructure. What we need to do in infrastructure is just make it business as usual. It shouldn't be an add-on. It shouldn't be an afterthought. We just should learn from our other sectors who've done this really well, and we can do it, and we can do it really quickly. We're really great at collaborating, and we're really great at conforming quickly. We've seen that come through in COVID, how quickly Australia adapted and conformed, and we can do this.
Thanks, Romilly. I think that's an interesting point to come to Natalie on the point around, you know, as Romilly says, we've got the capability, we've got the skills to do this. We need to collaborate, make it business as usual. What are you seeing from your vantage point, Natalie? And what are some of the things that might help us to accelerate that shift to business as usual? Do you think, in terms of, you know, is it just the passion and desire to collaborate and to step outside people's comfort zone? Or are there other things that we need to do to sort of accelerate this?
Yeah, sure. Look, I think, you know, the passion and desire is certainly there. And I've sort of seen through the water industry in particular, a lot more collaborative contract frameworks, putting into place things that actually consider the whole asset life cycle through various collaborative platforms, so that, you know, you don't get that disconnect between the planners and the designers and the constructors and those sorts of things. So I think there's certainly the willingness there. But I guess probably to touch on the point that I think Romilly made earlier around, all of the governments have made commitments, obviously, towards net zero by 2050. But I think what we're not seeing is that real sense of urgency in the departments and in the projects that are coming out to really embed that in terms of what we do. So I think there's a lot of willingness amongst everyone to really change how we think about things, to think differently, to try and reimagine infrastructure and all those good things. But I guess it's about trying to make sure that that's driven at that policy level as well. And I think one of the really important things is with all of the stimulus funding, there's a bit of a danger, I think, of charging off and delivering as quickly as we possibly can at the cheapest possible price. And, you know, one thing that we need in order to be able to actually think differently and look at green solutions and look at how we can make our infrastructure more sustainable is just that opportunity to step back and take a look at it. Maybe it takes time, maybe it doesn't. If you can get the right people in the room at the right time and really nut that collaboration piece out, it perhaps doesn't take any more time, but it at least needs the space, I guess, and the opportunity for those conversations to happen. So yeah, I guess from my end, it's really that sense of urgency about making a change that will help to embed it in what we do. The willingness is there in the industry for sure. I'm part of a International Consulting Engineers Sustainable Development Committee, and there's some great examples across the globe of some amazing projects that are going on, and definitely one thing that the engineering industry in particular is really embracing is the sustainability piece. But I guess it's just making sure that there's the space there for that infrastructure solution to be thought about a little bit differently, so that that we can embed sustainability, and then it does become business as usual. Once you've done it a few times, it's a lot easier, and it takes less time and becomes part of that business as usual scenario.
All right, well, we're going to turn to the audience questions, and we've got a few of them that have come through. I'm actually going to come to you on the first one, Romilly, because I think it'll be easily resolved. Someone's interested in, you did mention when you were talking about things that would stick in terms of trends, you talked about a report from the UK, and someone in the audience is very interested in the perhaps exact title or where they might be able to find that UK report that you've referred to.
Yes, I'm going to look it up quickly while you go to another question so I can come back to you. I literally read it like last week, but I've read so much lately, but I know where to find it. So just give me 2 ticks and I'm going to come back to you on that one. It was a really great report, so I'll come back to you on it.
Yeah, great. Excellent, Romilly. I mean, the benefits of live stream where we can look these things up and get people's answers as we go. There's a broader question, I think, that comes out of a number of the questions that we've got in the portal around climate change and sustainability, and I guess the fact that we don't necessarily have complete consensus on this topic, and perhaps nor will we ever. And there are vested interests in some instances. There are cases, obviously, there's a lot of discussion around how fast governments are moving in terms of their commitments and policies in this area. But I think through this discussion, Romilly, for example, has pointed out the fact that states do have net zero targets, and those need to be embedded in infrastructure requirements. Marie, I'm interested to come to you on this because obviously you're looking at this across the whole of the G20. It seems to me that we often wait for perhaps permission or kind of the consensus or the agreement on these things. Clearly, there are ways that governments, infrastructure providers, players in the sector can move without necessarily being required to by regulation. Where are you seeing some of the opportunities to really act now and to not wait for the answer on this?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I mean, in the sense that I think Natalie touched base on that, depending on where you are, people will reference back to the SDG or the ESG or the net zero target. But I think that's basically telling you that at this stage, there is still a lot of thinking. The public sector asked 5 years ago at the time of the Paris Agreement, 6 years now almost, to tell them really to actually accelerate. And what we've seen is that the private sector has accelerated, and I mentioned earlier about those particular survey that we published. And I think now this is really around for the governments to catch up. And that's really what we've seen all across the board is that, well, you have a couple of ESG standards that exist across infrastructure. At this time, it's very scattered. We could call them for infrastructure GRESB and Vision, SURE. And they're still at the time where a lot of different players are assessing really which one best to use. At the same time, government at the G20 last year, we had, it wasn't last year, it was the year before, under the Japanese presidency, we established what we call the Quality Infrastructure Investment Principle. So there was a very long negotiation, typical international cooperation negotiation, to define what was quality infrastructure. And so now we are in the process of developing indicators. So that's actually the International Finance Corporation was in charge of that. And this has been a long effort, right? Because obviously the question here is that there is a willingness to get from the gold standard, which is definitely where I think everybody would like to land. But because the G20 is a mix of developed economy and developing economies, there is a need to take into consideration what we call national circumstances, which is very much to ensure that they could have a roadmap to deploy that. As governments have different roadmap when you think about bank regulation and Basel and so on, just to leave them the opportunity to really get their way through that and understand this well. So this indicators is a work that we are continuing this year. It's probably going to continue under the Indonesian year. But if I wanted to then go back about what are the opportunities, right? So in the end, if you look at the environmental, social, and governance, definitely with all of those questions related to climate change, which has raised very highly in G20 and G7, a lot of emphasis is given on environmental targets. And I think we've seen, especially TCFD, for example, and the task force that the Financial Stability Board has put in place. So they are actually developing now some sort of indicators. So they will come a bit later this year, and probably during the Indonesian year too. But I think this is what we need to think about. And, you know, climate change is something we share. But under the social pillar, I think this is also what is actually very local. And, you know, why we are still trying to sort out all of those climate change targets, which are moving anyway, I think there is still an important low-hanging fruit opportunity for governments to think about the social pillar and really how to ensure that we could use infrastructure as a way to decrease inequality. Because I think what has shown COVID-19 very broadly is that the rise of inequality has really gone to the roof. And so that's quite important now to ensure that governments are really looking also in that social element, because that's something they could really manage even more, I would say, easily at the national level. On the climate change, of course, each country will have its target. It requires even more international cooperation, but really working on those standards on the social side, especially as we think about women and the benefit that women could get from infrastructure. Very few countries are looking at that. In 2018, we did publish a report on inclusive infrastructure. And what we realized is that the approach to inclusive infrastructure and more broadly vulnerable groups, so that was only women, but people with indigenous community, low-income groups, literally was not approached systematically. So I think there is definitely some work that could be done fast on that social component, because in the end, you know, infrastructure is built for the benefit of the community. And I think that's the thing we need to keep in mind as we're thinking about whatever the potential next step that could be accelerated in the next couple of years.
Thanks, Marie. Romilly, want to come to you?
I do.
If we get time, there is a question in the portal around inclusive infrastructure, but Romilly, go ahead.
So firstly, the reports from the National Infrastructure Commission called Behaviour Change and Infrastructure Beyond COVID-19, and the Commission analysis of a range of scenarios, which is what I was talking about, for how the use of public transport, broadband networks and utilities might change as a result of the pandemic. So it's under the UK National Infrastructure Commission. I just want to pick up a point that Marie said. We've got to appreciate that infrastructure is not just a whole, it's quite unique. So you have road, rail, energy, waste, water, social infrastructure. So I've covered off economic infrastructure and there's social infrastructure, as Marie also talked about. One of the things that's important is to set what needs to be done to help each of those different subsectors of infrastructure to set some sort of framework to drive forward. And the World Economic Forum and the Global Future Council have established 6 qualities of sustainable infrastructure that you could download and look up, and we've incorporated that into our sustainability principles ourselves. But it's really important that we're all speaking the same language and that we're all embedding it, but we also do appreciate that infrastructure is quite diverse across the different types of infrastructure about where they are, but I'm sure Natalie has more to add on that as well.
Thanks, Romilly. And Natalie?
Yeah, look, I think the start of the question, I guess, around climate change and some of the, you know, not everyone's on the same page with that. I think that's where the language part is really quite important. You know, that's probably where resilience has rung true in Australia because of, you know, droughts and floods and all those sorts of things that come around to us. So, you know, I think in order to really get that behavioural change and take people on the journey, it's about making sure things are, they make a lot of sense to them and that it really rings true in terms of what their experiences are.
Thanks, Natalie. And I think we've got time for one more question from the group. And I might come to you, Romilly, in the first instance on this. It seems to be a topic that comes up in a lot of conversations I'm in and a lot of non-infrastructure related conversations around water and water security, and this question is referred specifically to the US drought. What's the sort of IA advice, I guess, around water infrastructure at the moment, and perhaps, you know, going to some of Natalie's points also in a community sense around, you know, non-infrastructure solutions as well as infrastructure solutions around water, because clearly this is an issue that's on the mind of a lot of people around our future water security.
Infrastructure Australia does have has made a number of comments and has a number of positions when it comes to water. So in the infrastructure priority list, we identify the importance of a national approach to water security. In the audit that we released in 2019, we specifically had a water chapter, and in the plan we'll have a response to that when we talk about the different reforms that Infrastructure Australia believe are required when it comes to water. One of the things I will point out though is Australia is the driest continent, and what happens is it's high on our agenda and mind when we're in the middle of drought, and we found that recently, and then all of a sudden the drought diminishes around Australia, and then we focus on the next issue, and that we can't do that. It's like our focus on resilience and sustainability. When it comes to water, we need to continually be having these conversations and driving a view on the non-build, the technological responses that we can have to it, how we're engaging community on water. Water covers a broad area. Like there's potable water, there's non-potable water, there's community water, there's agricultural water. It's quite a broad area that you need to have a position on. So it's not one size fits all. But Infrastructure Australia has put out a number of different positions on water that you can find and download from our website.
Thanks, Romilly. And Natalie, obviously you are General Manager of Water and Environment, so it would be remiss of me not to ask your view on this as well.
Look, I think Romilly's hit the nail on the head to a certain extent. It's the piece around when we're in a drought, then it's top of everyone's mind. You catch a taxi and they talk to you about the water crisis and the drought, but when it's resolved, then you don't hear very much about it. So it's about keeping it front of mind. It's about making the community water literacy a whole lot higher so that people are consistently thinking about it and understanding the real and true value of water. But I think the other thing is that water becomes very political, and you can't plan water on a 4-year election cycle. It's something that you need to think about for the 20, the 50, the 100 years in advance. So that national approach and really trying to take it away from a political spectrum and make really good long-term water decisions with the community and with an informed community, I think are really crucial to trying to tackle the resilience piece around water security.
I am going to ask one last very quick question to you, Marie, because you touched on it previously in your comments around inclusive infrastructure. And we have a question here in the portal around, it's great to see women on the panel talking about infrastructure, but are we doing enough to ensure that we've got infrastructure that is designed for women and not just men? So interested in your views on that, Marie, particularly given that you touched on it previously.
Yeah, I think it's a fair one. I'm sure it's very close to the heart of also Romilly and Natalie. Because it starts here, right? It starts by ensuring that infrastructure is also thought by women. And then if you want to ensure that women will benefit down the line about this infrastructure, is really bringing their voice in the design, right? And at this very early stage. So having people like us, and I'm also like Natalie, I'm an engineer by first background. It's very important to have that into the value chain, right? But it's also a lot of the work that we're trying to do with governments at the G20 is really to understand what will be the benefit. And we know that if women benefit more from the infrastructure because they could get to jobs and so on, they will save more. And this savings will go to their kids' education, to the pension fund. So there is actually a real benefit into the economy. But I mean, over time, what you need to do is to bring this economic case for women in infrastructure or any other economic case. For example, we brought the economic case for infratech. So for governments to actually say, here is the background for me to start pushing very actively about it. So I think here it's two ways. I think there's definitely for governments to work on this economic case for women in infrastructure and more generally vulnerable groups. And the fact that this infrastructure will allow them to benefit more and to contribute more to the economy. And really on the private sector side, it's really ensuring that all of the people that are behind the scenes in designing all of those assets are actually also benefit from women's voice. So, I mean, it's not only also coming down to the engineers or the lawyers and so on, but it's really around the stakeholder engagement that we talked about previously, right? Ensuring that those voices could be heard and could be heard early into the process. And then that these two should work hand in hand, right? But I think on the government side, still a lot needs to be done. Policies are not particularly developed for all of those vulnerable groups equally across countries. And definitely some more work needs to be done in streamlining this aspect in the policy, because if it's in the policy, that will channel down to the projects and to the programs. But I think, as I said, also important that the governments really understand first what is the economy case, what is the impact on the economy, and this work is not widely available yet.
Well, thank you, Marie. I'm conscious of time and that we are coming up against that 11:10 barrier and the 10-minute break before the next session. But I want to thank this fantastic panel and for the discussion that we've had. I'm going away quite encouraged. There are considerable challenges, obviously, but Romilly's comments about having the skills and capabilities, Marie's comments about, the leadership that Australia has in this space, including through having Infrastructure Australia, and also Natalie's comments as well around what is happening on the ground as well. I'm incredibly encouraged, and I look forward to continuing to watch this space. We are going to have a 10-minute break, and then Melinda Salento will be back to chair a panel on tertiary education and the future of tertiary education. So please tune in for that. Thank you very much.